And I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. Usually most people know me, but I see a lot of new faces around the room, so I'll introduce myself. My name is Maya Greeno, and I manage Interactions, Evaluation, and Program Effectiveness Working Group. So this is our meeting on progress on measuring resilience, because in July, John agreed to share Mercy Corps' experience on what they've done to measure resilience. And so he presented some of the challenges to evaluating resilience and some approaches that have been developed, including Mercy Corps' own approach. And so today is sort of a follow-on to that meeting. So I'll just lay out a bit about our agenda. And then before we actually jump into the presentations, if we could go around the room so everyone knows who's here. But I'll just give you how the afternoon is going to go now. So first we'll be hearing from Mark Constas, who's Associate Professor at Cornell University. And Mark also is the chair of the Food Security Information Network Resilience Measurement Technical Working Group. And he'll be presenting on the second technical paper that working group has produced, a common analytical model for on which resilience measurement could be based. Then we'll hear from Tim, who will present on the resilience measurement methodology and indicators used for the impact evaluation of USAID's Feed the Future Prime project in Ethiopia. And then I'll turn it over to John, who will present on the approach Mercy Corps used in the Philippines to analyze the determinants of household resilience to and recovery from Typhoon Yolanda. Basically, they will each present for 15 minutes, and then we'll take 5 minutes of clarifying questions after each presentation, and then at the very end, we'll have a longer period for Q&A. And sorry, I didn't properly introduce Tim and John. So Tim is president of TANGO International, and John is director of research and learning at Mercy Corps. Maybe we could go around the room, starting with my colleague over there.
Hi, I'm Lauren Van and I work at USAID. I'm Tanya Rawl with Care USA. Lauren Sergio with TAC. I'm Katie Costina with Return for Relief.
I'm Dan Hudner with Mercy Corps.
I'm Maureen Murphy with the American Red Cross.
Carlisle Levine with a variety of hats.
Oh, I'm Mark Constas. Sorry, at Cornell University. John Kurtz, Mercy Corps. Tim Frankenberger with TANGO International.
Amber Anderson, World Vision.
Andrew Bisson, Mexico. Emmanuel Funcina from America. Josh White with World Vision.
Mark Millis with Inside NGO.
Then Mark, we'll turn it over to you. I'm not going to unmute the people on the line, but there's people from CRS, IRC, American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, HEFR, and others. And freedom. So just let you go straight to the presentation.
Well, thank you, and thanks for bringing together this group. We've got a full room, which is nice. The sequence of presentations is no accident. As we began, I asked about the sequence, and I said, "What's the sequence?" Tim said, "Well, you have to go first," because I begin with an academic and more abstract presentation, and then we get down to a more concrete and talk about specific applications. So the presentation I have here, and in fact, the work of the technical working group is meant to be broadly applicable across a range of contexts, a range of programs, in fact, a range of geographies. The work we do in the technical working group is a response to the groundswell that we've all experienced in the resilience in the development and humanitarian aid communities and the call for greater resilience programming. So let me start here and just give you some background. I navigate with arrows.
Try clicking. Sometimes you have to escape and do it again just because of the website.
Okay. So as you're all aware, the combined effect of climate change, economic forces, and socio-political conditions have increased the frequency, severity of exposure, risk exposure among vulnerable populations, and in fact decreased the predictability of it. And for this reason, interest in resilience has increased with an associated call for measurement. The measurement call, as typically happens, lags behind the immediate call for program, for policy in this area. In response to this, the Resilience Measurement Technical Work Group was formed in June of 2013. We're roughly 18 months into operation with this work. It's important to note that this is an outcome of the expert consultation on resilience measurement for food security that was held in February 2013. And I know, John, you were there at that meeting. Tim was. I don't know if anyone else attended that meeting in Rome. That was jointly sponsored by FAO and WFP, and maybe others. I'm not sure. An important resource there, by the way, to go back if you want the genesis of the work on resilience measurement, is to look at the AgriLinks summary that TANGO produced around this. It's a really useful point of reference and on resilience measurement. It captures what happened in that meeting. So the motivation for technical work is why measure resilience? Well, we need empirical evidence of what factors contribute to resilience under what context and for what types of shocks. The emphasis on shocks here is critical, and that's a key part, as we'll see in a moment, of recommendations we make for measuring resilience. But what we're talking about here is trying to provide guidance on what data needs to be collected using what tools at what points in time and what populations in response to what shocks to predict development outcomes that relate to some area of well-being. And it being indexed, resilience being indexed to a well-being outcome is critical. It could be food security, it could be poverty, it could be another development outcomes. The membership of the group, there are two co-conspirators here in the group. Both Tim and John are in the Resilience Measurement Technical Working Group that was formed back in June 2013. It's meant to be a representation of NGOs and of UN agencies and also of academic institutions and technical assistance organizations. So far we've produced 2 papers trying to advance resilience measurement as an area that supports and informs our programming. The first paper was produced in January 2014, roughly 6 months after we began, and resilience measurement principles toward an agenda for measurement design. The idea of that paper, as background before I get to the second paper, was to talk about really laying the table. What are the challenges of designing and designing resilience measures and actually implementing them in field settings? In that paper, what we did, I think that was very important. One is we provided a definition of resilience, which I'll get to in a moment, and we also outlined 10 principles that should guide thinking about how one actually designs resilience measures. The second paper, which just came out 1 week ago, is a common analytical model for resilience measurement, causal framework and methodological options. The reference to a causal framework is important, and it also calls attention to something that we hope to do moving forward, and that is draw tighter connections between causal models and estimation models that are the bread and butter of people who do econometrics and people who do statistical analysis and theories of change. That's a steep climb. That's not easy work to do. There are different communities. They don't hang out in the same bars. Even if they do, they don't drink the same drinks. We need to get those communities. Tanya and I'm doing work with CARE. We've experienced the challenges of doing that, but we're continuing to work in that avenue. Some of this is different languages, but I think creating a bridge is important. That's the thin end of the wedge. That paper represents the causal framework does in an attempt to bring those together. So those are 2 papers we have. The additional accomplishments in the technical working group is we've reached consensus on a definition of resilience. That is a real accomplishment. Many of you have probably, if you've attended resilience meetings, have been in many meetings, and at the end of the meeting, there's something I didn't certainly use this phrase, something I refer to as a semantic thud. And at the end of the day, people say, I'm still not sure what resilience is. You think, how could that be? And so there's a reason for that that I'll go into in a moment. And so we've reached consensus. At least there are 20 people in the world who seem to agree on this. And we're trying to convince others that this is a good point of departure. Secondly, we plan a series of technical briefings on resilience measurement. I'll talk about that toward the end, that are going beyond the second papers, that are very focused papers about pages each on specific aspects of the resilience measurement agenda that the technical work group has laid out. Thirdly, we've established community practice on resilience measurement. For those of you who are familiar with the FSIN, the Food Security Information Network, they have about 800 people in there, active in their community practice. Over 500 of those are involved in resilience measurements. So we are holding down the majority. The analytic nerds, for the moment, are vaguely popular. Fourthly, we've directed attention to measurement as a vital part of the resilience agenda. And again, trying to build a closer connection between the work of analysts and people who do measurement and M&E and the work of programming. And I know for those of you who do M&E in organizations, that's a regular challenge is how to build that connection. So the organization of the presentation following, one, I'll introduce a definition of resilience and talk about a little, very brief form, why I think there can be confusion after, say, a day-long meeting. People still aren't sure what resilience is. Focus on paper 2, and then next steps for the technical working group. And maybe if time, probably in the question, we'll talk about the future of the technical working group. For those of you, how many have heard of the technical working group before coming to this meeting? Okay, a number of you have. There were rumors floating all around that it was going to dissolve, and my response is a bit of a Python like comment, not dead yet. And in fact, we're far from dead. I think there's an ascendant pattern here. So yeah, the other go. Okay. So the definition of resilience that we settled on is that resilience is defined as a capacity that ensures stresses and shocks do not have long-lasting adverse development consequences. Now, there are several things that are worth highlighting within our definition that we go into in paper number 1 and in more detail in paper 2. The first is that it places resilience as in a capacity focus that resides within humans and in the systems that humans are involved in, also in other systems that support human well-being. It's necessarily multidimensional, just as poverty measures people eventually realize those need to be multidimensional. It's shock and context specific. While there may be generic forms of resilience, it has to be linked to a particular shock and linked to a particular context. Part of the work we have to do moving forward is to unpack context. It's quite common in our work. We make assertions and then we say, well, it depends on the context. Well, that's nice, but we need to unpack context and measure what the most critical factors are. Fourthly, it's linked to an outcome of interest, and the resilience must be indexed to some well-being and indicator. And in fact, the particular capacities that allow someone to be resilient, or some unit at the household community to be resilient, may vary depending on the outcome we're talking about. So therefore, it has instrumental value. The one thing I want to mention here, let me stay here for a moment, is that I'll try to unpack it in this next slide. One of the reasons I think people can sit in a room or in multiple meetings and still not be sure what resilience is that people walk into a room such as this with 3 different views of what resilience might be. 1, it's a predictor. 2, it's an outcome. And 3, it's a relationship between a predictor and an outcome. And I think all these things are true, and you have to kind of hold them in your head simultaneously and realize that they are all those elements, and the fact that they're all those means that we have to measure each one of those things maybe in a little bit different way with resilience on the table, not just as something we observe, but also as an analytical approach to understanding shock response dynamics in relation to well-being. So we're looking at the functional relationship between it as an input, here the capacity, and as a development outcome, and the connection between the two. But I think this is part of the problem. People walk in saying, I'm thinking it's the right-hand term, in econometric terms. It's a predictor. Someone else looking at it as an outcome. What I'll say here, and I think Tim and John can correct this, because they sat in the meetings as well with the technical working group, is we're not talking about a new predictor. We're still interested in food security. We're still interested in alleviating poverty. We're interested in doing everything we can programmatically to underwrite future well-being in the face of shocks. That's not changed. There's no new outcome here. There's a new set of predictors that fall under the category of resilient capacity. And Tim, and I think in the work through Mercy Corps, is going to demonstrate that they are effective in acting as a way to mediate shocks. So toward the end of this, I'll make the slides available. There's a more developed econometric model. So basically looking at a development outcome is a function of vulnerability, resilience, capacity, and shocks. I put this here. I won't go too much into the text, but the parenthetical arrangement of terms here is pretty important. we are drawing a distinction between vulnerability and resilience. Resilience is different than vulnerability. It's not just the inverse of it. And it's entirely possible for those of you working in developing contexts to know that, or to observe that some populations can be both vulnerable and will be repeatedly, but they also can be resilient. And that's a question. I think that will eventually be settled empirically. But in an early meeting back in the Rome meeting in February 2013, a colleague from the World Food Program stood up and he said, the people I'm working with fully are always going to be vulnerable. And if you're saying that to be resilient means you're not vulnerable, then I have nothing to do with this framework. So this is something to be, here I pose it as a question. I think eventually it will be settled empirically as relates to between vulnerability and resilient capacity. How much time?
Maybe a couple more.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip through this to make it available to you. Tim will, and I think both John will speak to the different types of resilience capacities. I won't do this. What I do want to go to is talk to you about the core and the distinction between a conceptual model and analytical model, and talk about the core features of paper number 2 which we developed. So part of what I'm doing here is to really draw your attention to the paper as a resource to think more deeply about these things. An analytical model, as distinct from a conceptual model, has specific guidance on the timing of data collection, the characteristics to be measured, how to access those characteristics empirically using different methods. It has technical criteria for data quality, and it provides information how data are represented as change over time based on theories of change. This is where the estimation model and the econometric model should get together. It's a specific structure and techniques used to model data and make inferences or argue changes in them. So the components of a common analytical framework that we discuss in the paper are there are assumptions about the resilience construct where it's important calling attention to the importance of defining it. There's a causal framework that I mentioned a moment ago. There are resilience indicators and data structure, which I think both Tim and John will talk about these. And there's the resilience expected trajectory, which says at what point in time do you expect a change to occur? What is the rate of change? And let me just spend a minute talking about it. I think it's really important. A lot of things we measure in resilience, or a lot of the work we do in M&E, are based on arbitrary time frames that have to correspond to things like funding cycles and baseline, midlines, and end lines, which has nothing to do with the realities of what we're studying, except the realities of donor communities that want reports. Right. Let's say we then argue that an important aspect of resilience is measuring institutions and governance. Is that going to happen in a 1 or 2, 3, 4-year cycle? Probably not. So how do we know if we're succeeding in that? This is one of the challenges. Understanding the expected trajectory is really important. If we're measuring, say, the response to an iron supplement to anemia, the biological mechanisms gives a pretty good indication of when that needs to show up. Where's the reservoir of knowledge that tells us how long we have to wait to look for governance changes or for building communities? This is work that needs to be done. So the other part that I mentioned that's key and the core element of our paper is the resilience measurement causal framework. What's important about this from a measurement point of view, it tells us at what point data need to be collected. An ex ante, looking at initial states and capacities, a disturbance component, looking at shocks and stressors, and ex post component. And looking down at the bottom here, whoops, there's well, you can't see further down. There are local components, being able to interpret these in terms of local context, and looking at categories of indicators such as political factors, cultural factors, and agri-ecological factors. The one thing I want to say here, I won't read off all this, is that in our meetings, the technical working group, perhaps because the meetings were held in Rome initially, we talked about a Fiat version and a Maserati version of measurement. And a lot of what we're presenting here may may look like the Maserati version, and I think what we have to do is figure out ways to leverage existing data that we have at hand through secondary data sets, through existing measures that we're already using, and figure out ways to capitalize on those to get close to this. I think the important part of this, though, is the sequence going from ex ante to an ex post component, and understanding that on the left-hand side we have multiple scales, and on the right-hand side we have multiple methods that need to be deployed. The other part here, and this is a precursor to, I believe, what Tim was talking about, we also propose a resilience capacity to data structure with different categories of data, sample indicators, and different resilience functions, absorptive, adaptive, and transformative, and the importance of looking at multiple methods and different levels and time periods and trigger events. There's a lot I could say here about what makes resilience different than vulnerability. This is part of it. Resilience carries with it not just an area of empirical focus or M&E focus. It carries with it a whole different analytical approach. Not a whole different, but a different analytical approach that drives in a particular direction. Tim, in conversation, has used the word, gives you a lens through which you can look at some of the problems in development. I'll skip through this just to, in the interest of time, just talk about next steps and where we're going, and then I'll end with opportunities and challenges and pass it over. Then we have 5 more products that will be coming out in the next few months. These are briefings, technical briefings of 5 to 7 pages I mentioned before, which means that probably will be read more than the longer papers will. We have a shocks and stresses cluster asking what are the issues that need to be considered in order to measure the nature and consequences of multi-source shocks that affect food and nutrition security. In health, in the field of public health and in areas of medicine, they often talk about comorbidity, or that there are multiple shocks that interact, and here too we need to think about the way shocks interact with one another. There's a scale and systems cluster. A paper will come out that talks about different levels at which resilience data should be collected and what's the best way to conceptualize and assess dependencies that exist over multiple scales within and across interacting systems over varying time periods. Households exist in communities, exist in regions, exist in countries, and there are dependencies. It's not a matter of just aggregating data. It's important to look at interactions. Qualitative subjective measures cluster. Dan Maxwell, who was just here this morning, is giving a talk in one room over, is leading that cluster and providing guidance on how to think about qualitative subjective measures. Estimation and explanatory models cluster, the one that's perhaps not the most popular among the ones we're doing, but it's certainly necessary. What are the key features of how resilience will be modeled? What are the methodological conditions such as sampling design, number of weights, the panel data, counterfactuals need to be satisfied? And not most importantly, but certainly very important, the last one, again, trying to think of ways we can leverage existing data that we have in hand. In early meetings, I remember some years ago in talking with CARE, they raised the question, does this mean we have to collect new data? And the answer is maybe, probably, but it doesn't mean it's all new data. We have to think about ways to leverage existing data. I'll end just talking about opportunities and challenges, some of these I've mentioned before. Leveraging existing data and ongoing data collection efforts, first. Second, dealing with restricted time frames for reporting required by donors and agencies. There needs to be an education outreach program for donors and to groups such as the USAID and to their community looking up to have longer time frames. This has happened in other fields where they stretch funding cycles out from a typical 3-year to a 5-year and even to a 7-year funding cycle. Maybe this needs to happen within some of our work as well. Capitalizing on cell phone, managing cost and capacity issues associated with multi-scale data collection is critical, particularly in field settings. Capitalizing on cell phone-based data collection platforms for frequent, timely collection of measurements. Again, this is trying to protect against the downside cost issues and having more frequent data collection. And identifying workable modeling procedures for resilience that reflect the full complexity of a systems approach on which resilience programming is based. And again, that's a call to try to close that gap between the analytical work of people who are doing modeling and people who are doing modeling for programming purposes. So I will stop there. Probably haven't gone over time, and I apologize for that. And pass it to John. Yeah.
Tim next. But any clarifying questions before we need to move on to the next presentation? And those on the phone, you're on mute just because we were getting background noise at the beginning, but feel free to type in your question in the chat and I can pose it on your behalf.
I have a question. It's more of a follow-up, not a clarity question. Should I hold it?
What do you?
So in the technical briefing that I believe you alluded to skills and systems cluster working on and just looking at household data, I was wondering how you have identified the importance of gender as a factor to disaggregate the data by, or any of the principles that you've looked at, maybe in the first paper on resilience.
Yeah, both on our first paper, second paper, we know the gender is important. Of course, not very smart if we didn't. So gender is highlighted, but I would say though it's not sufficiently unpacked, and we haven't taken it as we haven't asked the question. The question that needs to be asked is that if resilience is the capacity to respond to, anticipate and respond to shocks in a protracted period of time that ends up having well-being being relatively smooth and at above a normative threshold, then what is the role of gendered issues within that? We've not posed that question. It's a question that needs to be asked. And I think that, I think that a lot of what the paper hopefully will do, or two papers will one, put the idea of some of the ideas of measurement into circulation, and people will detect inadequacies and deficiencies where further attention needs to be developed. And I think there probably should be a standalone piece of work on the role of women in resilience. We didn't do that, but I think someone could do that, probably should do that. Yeah.
I think just a clarification of how these papers fit in. So certainly there is a good bit of work being done. I know Kara's doing a lot of work. We also just do qualitative work to come up with theories of change around gender equity and resilience and what might link the two. In this case, I think the measurement guidance is more generic in the sense that, if we have a theory that we want to examine, this is laying out what are the requirements to be able to do that and say something meaningful about resilience. So I don't think you can go into the specifics of what are the gender dynamics or governance dynamics or whatever the technical issue is.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we should probably move on to your presentation unless you just wanted to add something quick about.
No, I think what you'll see, and I don't know what John's going to say, but you'll see in the presentations that where we've actually tried to take the analytical framework and apply it. We have been looking at those gender dynamics, both qualitatively and quantitatively, and try to understand them better using a resilience lens. So the presentation I'm going to make is actually a shorter version of the longer one I gave yesterday. For those of you who want the full Monty, it's on the FSN network. There's the actual slideshow and the actual talk. They've got me recorded talking, so if you need an hour of me speaking to you, that's where you can go. So what I'm trying to say here is that this is a very complex effort that we've been trying to actually apply the conceptual framework in Ethiopia for measuring resilience. There's a feedback, USAID Feed the Future feedback baseline that we have done for the PRIME project, which is being implemented by Mercy Corps with CARE and a number of other partners. And they are trying to promote resilience in the Somali, Bahraina, and Afar regions of Ethiopia, very tough pastoral areas. And so one of the things that's really striking about that region is that it is very shock prone. So if you needed to pick a place to actually see how people's resilience operates in an area that's continually hammered by shocks, and that's the place to do it. In the survey, the baseline survey that we did, we found that 87% of the households that were interviewed, of almost 3,200, had experienced major shocks in the last year. So, majority. So the point is that we are really taking this measurement framework seriously, and so we wanted to see how you actually operationalize many of these concepts that Mark was talking about. So one of the first things that we wanted to do was try to understand, okay, if you are going to be looking at shocks, how do you actually measure that? How do you measure not only the kinds of shocks people are exposed to, but the severity of those shocks, and people's ability to actually manage those shocks? So we had to come up with particular measures for that. We also were interested in the outcomes that we're indexing the capacities to. So we had measures of food security, we had measures of nutrition, we had measures of poverty. And so we wanted to see, okay, given these shocks, what are the effects of those shocks on those outcomes? And then we also wanted to look at a series of capacities. And we talked about absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. Absorptive capacity, much of the thinking around that comes out of the disaster risk reduction work. Many of you that may have been involved in doing DRR work as part of relief or recovery programs. So it's focusing not only on preventing shocks from overcoming households and communities, but also helping households and communities recover from those shocks and stresses. So as both an ex-ante and an ex-post relationship. We also were interested in adaptive capacity, which actually comes out of the work on climate change, where people are trying to proactively manage the change that they're exposed to. And so but whether that be due to changing weather conditions or changing economic conditions or even changing political conditions, how do they actually manage that change in a proactive way so that they can not lose all their assets and not end up starving to death when these changes occur. So the third type of capacity that we're interested in is what we call transformative capacity. This is more of a systems level. It tends to be the enabling conditions that are in place, where you're trying to make sure that you have good governance, that you have infrastructure, that you have appropriate policies, that you have appropriate social service delivery. We have market systems are operating effectively, so that people have the opportunity to actually manage shocks and stresses in a way that allows them to not be overwhelmed by some large collective risk. So in those places where you have only protracted crises, where you don't have real government, or where you have very weak government, it's very difficult to find transformative capacity that you can work on in a situation like that. So oftentimes, you may be able to strengthen people's absorptive and adaptive capacity, but the transformative capacity is what really makes resilience more sustainable. So, so we were then trying to figure out, okay, based on a lot of thought that went behind the indicators that were constructing these different capacities, what would those look like? And so we have a series of indicators that we've put together for each of these types of capacities. Under absorptive capacity, we were looking at households' perceived ability to recover from shocks, the social capital, and there are three types of social capital that we're interested in. Those of you who have read Daniel Aldrich's book on social capital and managing disasters will see that he talks about bonding social capital, bridging social capital, and linking social capital. Bonding is like if we were all in a community and we were helping each other out, that would be the interactions that are between us. Bridging social capital is where you are connected to another community or individuals that are outside of the same risk profile that you were in, that you can draw on that support when you need it. So it would be like Somalis having relatives in Minnesota that they could have remittances sent back to help them recover from the 2011 famine. Linking social capital is where you're actually connected to people that have some power relationship. It could be government, it could be NGOs, it could be private sector, but it's connected to that power structure that allows you to bring resources from, in a vertical way, to you. So for example, if you have good connections with the people that are in charge of the formal safety nets that operate in an area, you're able to get that help for your village sooner than somebody that doesn't have that kind of connection. So all three of these types of social capital are extremely important in resilience, and you need to measure these, and some of these things can be measured quantitatively, but a lot of these are measured only qualitatively. So that's why you need a mixed method approach to be able to do this properly. So we've constructed a series of indices around each of these types of capacities, and in fact, even though it looks like single indicators, many of those have indices related to them as well. So even when we talk about bridging social capital or linking social capital or bonding social capital, that actually is constructed from a series of questions that we're asking, and we're creating an index out of that. Or the household perceived ability to recover from shocks, that's a very complicated index that we created to capture that. So these indicators are actually constructed of other indicators, so it's important to understand that. One of the things that we found when we had this measure of shocks, we had this measure of these outcomes, we had this measure of capacities, wanted to know what the effect of those things are. So the results suggest that resilience capacity has a positive influence on the household food security in the project area. That those places where we found greater resilience capacity, we found higher calorie consumption, higher diet diversity, lower food insecurity, and less hunger. And the transformative capacity, which is that enabling condition stuff, is stronger impact than adaptive capacity, and the adaptive capacity has a stronger impact than absorptive capacity. So, but you need all three to really bring about the positive change that you're hoping for. And again, the papers that this is all found in are just, those are going to be available. Those of you that like to read, the volume 1 of the baseline is about 150 pages long, and volume 2 is another 30 or 40 pages. But the 46 PowerPoint is on the FSN, so you don't have to read through the whole thing. It pulls out the main things. But if you're really into data and you really want to see all the numbers, I suggest that you read those reports, and they'll be available on AgriLinks within the next couple of days. So the other thing that's important is that, oh, I keep hitting the wrong button. All right. We also were interested in community resilience. And so those of you who aren't familiar with the paper that we wrote on community resilience, if you go to AgriLinks again, there's a paper that we wrote on how to measure community resilience. And in there, that paper focuses on the major issue that we're interested in around community resilience is what we call collective action. We're interested in 5 types of collective action. Collective action that is related to providing social safety nets, so each of us helping each other out when one of our fields doesn't produce, or one of our kids gets sick, or main income earners dies of HIV/AIDS. There's collective action around safety net for those populations. The second type of collective action that we're interested in is disaster risk reduction. So people that are able to mobilize themselves to put in dams or construct dikes or other things that will prevent the community from being overwhelmed by a flood, or things that you can do to help with dealing with droughts. All of those things are important as a collective action activity. The third type of collective action we're interested in is natural resource management, both the pasture and forest resources as well as water resources. The fifth type of collective action we're interested in is conflict mitigation. If you're in an area where there's a lot of competition over pasture resources and water resources, can you actually work with the other communities that are competing for these resources in a positive way so that you aren't constantly fighting with each other or getting all your males killed off, and like we have in some of the Somali areas that we're working in. And then the fifth type of collective action is what we call public goods maintenance. And so every community has public goods such as schools or clinics or roads or water systems. All of these things, if the community doesn't maintain them, then it makes it very difficult. The opportunity costs go up dramatically for people to get access to services if those things are not protected. So we're really interested in trying to determine where the community resilience also had a positive effect on reducing food insecurity in this area. What we found was that the community resilience is not very strong in most of these communities. That collective action activities were fairly weak, except for around a couple of things. And so one of the things that the project needs to focus on in the next 5 years is trying to strengthen this community resilience. And that's really what the project is aimed at trying to do. They're trying to improve people's ability to manage natural resources. They're trying to make sure that conflict is mitigated. They're trying to improve the disaster risk reduction, early warning systems, etc. So we should see positive change in these collective action activities in these communities, and therefore community resilience should go up over time in this project area, hopefully. But it did have an association with avoiding the most extreme roles of hunger, but it did not have any effect on the other measures that we used. So think that's kind of an important point. It doesn't mean we don't continue to try to measure it, even though it doesn't have much of an effect. We need to kind of unpack that and try to understand it better, why it didn't have an effect. Okay, so of course then we had to do the multivariate analysis, and as Mark could have blinded you with a formula too. I didn't want to blind you with any formulas, but what we did find though, when you actually are running the regressions that tell you, does resilience capacity actually buffer households to shocks and stresses so that they can achieve certain livelihood or food security outcomes, we found that it actually did. That the resilience capacity does play this buffering role, that the interaction terms are really high for these experiential type of food security measures, that the results suggest that shock exposure increases food insecurity, but less so the higher the household resilience capacity. And this is consistent with our theory. We were hoping it would be consistent, and in fact it is. That in the primary, resilience capacity shields households from the negative impacts of shocks. And this can be illustrated by this table right here. You see along the vertical axis, we're looking at household food insecurity access, and on the horizontal axis, we're looking at shock exposure. So as the shocks go up, okay, so RC stands for resilience capacity. So the higher the resilience capacity, 58 is higher than 38, the lower the slope. Okay, so what that means is that capacity is actually protecting households even as the shock exposure goes up. It's preventing them from going up in terms of food insecurity. So this is a very important finding, and what it does is it holds nicely to the theory that we've been hammering on for the last year. And so it's one of the first real examples of us showing how to measure it. Do I have any time left, or am I done?
That's it.
Okay, well, all I wanted to say about that is that again, this shows that resilience capacity does mediate the relationship between shock exposure and food security, that the implied impact of shock exposure on this experiential variable for food security, it shows that the slopes are lower the higher the level of resilience capacity. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that this baseline study indicates that resilience appears to be higher in the Borana region than the Jijiga region, and higher among pastoralists than the agro-pastoralists and non-pastoralists that work in those areas. Now, a lot of people say, well, is that really true? Pastoralists are more resilient than everybody else, and actually, in this case, they are. The baseline survey also shows that all three groups of households are highly food insecure and vulnerable. The poverty rates are almost 57% in this area as compared to the rest of Ethiopia, 30%. And they're vulnerable to multiple types of shocks. These households and communities need to be strengthened. Their resilience needs to be strengthened to prevent further deprivation, and that's what the project is aimed to do. It's actually focusing on all three of those types of capacities. It's trying to strengthen the enabling conditions by improving market access. It's trying to strengthen community resilience by focusing on these collective action activities, and it's trying to strengthen household resilience by diversifying the opportunities for households so that they're not exposed to the same kinds of risk profiles as they would be if they were with this climate risk. And then we also are trying to capture changes in resilience over the life of the project, and so we've actually got another recurrent monitoring system that we have in place. And that recurrent monitoring system essentially are shorter surveys that you only implement the survey when a shock hits. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to determine what the real-time effect of that shock is on households. So a shock recently hit, a big drought, and so that launched a survey. This survey is a panel data set, so we take a subset of the 3,200 households, and we're monitoring those households over time. We're collecting data from those households once a month for 6 months to actually watch to see how they are managing that shock over time. So the idea is that we're going to do 2 rounds of this year and next year. And as the project improves these capacities, we should see their ability to manage these shocks and stresses actually improve over time if the project is, if its theory of change is correct and it's actually focusing on the right things. So this real-time measurement is really important. And if you only measure stuff at the beginning and at the end, do you think that slide shows that? No. If you only got stuff that measures stuff at the beginning and the end, actually during that 5-year period, it actually looks like this. Okay, so people are not kind of going up this way in terms of improvement. They're actually going up and down, up and down. So we want to understand that pattern. You know, that's why when Mark was talking about the time of when you collect information has to be consistent with the context that you're working in and the changes that are happening with regards to shocks and stresses that those communities are exposed to. That's the only way whether you're going to know whether people actually are more resilient or not. And so that's what we were trying to do with this recurrent monitoring system. And that's, those of you that would like more information on that, we can make that available to you too. We just completed the second round, so we have 2 rounds of data now. We got 4 to go. So I'm done.
Thank you. Any burning clarifying questions?
Oh, sorry. I actually had. No, I wasn't planning on showing these. These are what I wanted to show is that we've actually taken a shot at reducing the number of indicators. And we wanted to make sure that they were consistently measuring the same things, so we were able to cut each of those capacities down to 4 indicators each and still not lose much explanatory power. So that's worked. That just saved about, I don't know, $50,000 in the survey, maybe 100.
Factor analysis.
Yeah.
Burning clarifying question, and if you could please introduce yourself just so people on the phone know who's talking.
Yes, good. My name is Angelica Ospina, and I'm a Senior Technical Advisor for Resilience at Lutheran World Relief.
Oh, okay.
So I guess thank you so much for the presentation. Very short question is, did you manage to find any negative evidence or evidence on the potential impact of the development intervention undermining the resilience or any of the attributes of resilience?
The interventions of the PRIME project?
Yeah. In any way, did you
Too early to tell. This was just the baseline, so they haven't really implemented. They're just implementing the project seriously now, so we'll be watching for that. But we tried to get as early in the project as we could, so that we could actually capture the change. So they hadn't screwed up anything yet.
Is there a question?
Andrew Bristol of Mexico. So that last point is the sort of holy grail that you can reduce it down to measuring 4 things or whatever. Was that because those indicators were closely correlated with the other ones, or was it that they had a disproportionately large effect in their own right?
They had a large effect in their own right, but I want to caution anybody from trying to whittle it down too much. Yeah. Okay, because you know I did that because Greg Collins from USAID asked me to do that, but what's important is the context will vary from one location to the next, and what may not look like an important indicator now might be a very important indicator in that context. And so you need to be very cautious about just wholesaling, taking one thing and putting it in another location, because these pastoral areas are completely different than other areas that you might be doing this resilience work in. So I would start with a longer list and then work down from that in other contexts. But in this context, it was important for us to know what ones we could start whittling down. That'll help us streamline the data collection later when we're doing more monitoring.
A program, if you have a shock context, you could start to work out which development algorithm, livelihood strategy would build that type of resilience. Right. So it's certainly useful.
Yes. In fact, we're having a meeting in January, right, John, to go over these results with Mercy Corps in Ethiopia, and not just Mercy Corps, but other practitioners in Ethiopia to try to learn from this, figure out what implications does this have for programming, etc.
But the key part of what they've done is that while those 4 simply are not likely to be broadly generalizable, they'll be context dependent, the methodology they employ to get to the 4 can be used anywhere. It is a sound methodology, and that's the key. And I think if you do it across multiple contexts, multiple interventions, some things may emerge from that kind of analytic approach over and over. So,
yeah, I think one of the things that I think the technical working group is really trying to emphasize here is we need a lot more examples. Here's one, John's trying to generate a bunch more. All the NGOs need to be generating more and more examples so that we can learn from that and kind of get better at this stuff. Get better at how we construct these indices, get better at how we measure these things. And so, we need to encourage people to go out and try stuff and see what happens.
And to that end, I think early next year we'll have a presentation from LWR on how they approach resilience measurements. So
we're helping you guys.
Stay tuned for that. John, over to you.
Super. What do I find?
Oh, did it get close? Here, if you go to share, that folder,
yeah.
I think it's in there. Oh no, here.
That's it. Yeah. Although Jim Rue's presentation, not recently, maybe that'd be more interesting. All right. So, as a representative of an NGO, my presentation gets to be filled with more pictures, but lighter on content. Straight off, right? So, what I want to talk through is an application of a resilience measurement approach that takes on board a lot of what Mark and Tim presented. That Mercy Corps used recently in the Philippines as part of our response to the Typhoon Yolanda that hit there a year ago. I want to give credit to Dan, my colleague, who did most of the heavy lifting on this study in terms of the analysis. So if there's any technical questions,
Give him to Dan.
I'll talk through at first just the series of changes that we examined through the research, and then spend the bulk of the time on the data requirements and trying to clarify what data we collected maps back to the framework that Mark presented. Briefly talk about how we analyzed this data, share the main findings just to give you a flavor for what we can say from these kinds of studies, and then share my thoughts on what the implications for the resilience measurement are from this experience. Okay, so I have a confession that when the typhoon hit, one of my first thoughts was, this would make for really interesting research. And sure enough, it has. So people know the background more or less. Mercy Corps started responding with relief and more economic recovery programming shortly after the typhoon hit last November. And as part of us getting off the ground and doing our assessment work, we were able to put in place a research and learning agenda, essentially. And then the main question that we were setting out across the different studies that we've been doing there was to try to understand, are our responses around recovery likely to be building the types of capacities that are going to be useful for people to be resilient to future typhoons and other natural disasters that are sure to occur. So that was the underlying thinking that we approached this with. The main recovery program that Mercy Corps has been implementing up to now there is essentially a cash transfer combined with financial literacy and then financial inclusion activities. The main goal is livelihoods resilience, which more or less we're equating with recovery, in terms of assets, shelter, and other livelihood assets, as well as consumption smoothing. So the research sort of fell out of this theory of change. Basically, we're going in and doing financial inclusion with the hope that if people are better connected with financial institutions and have access to credit, loans, insurance, that those will come in handy in the future to be able to to help buffer them from future shocks. So we translate that into some research questions, some of which are directly related to the program, others that we added in as part of a larger resilience learning agenda. So on financial inclusion, what we were looking at was whether or not being financially included bolsters household resilience to natural disasters. And if so, which types of financial products or services are linked to more successful recovery? Here we looked at formal versus informal, loan versus savings, insurance, and a range of things. The second set of questions was around livelihood diversification. There's a lot of assumptions that having more diverse livelihoods spreads risk, and therefore people are less exposed to shocks or can recover more quickly. So we were putting that to the test here by looking at income diversification as well as what we were calling independence of income sources across different activities, and whether or not those were linked to the greater resilience or recovery from the disaster. And the third area was around some of what Tim was talking about around social capital, particularly around the first one, bonding, assistance from other community members as part of the emergency response. But then it occurred to us, well, there's also all these other forms of assistance going on. So how does that assistance that people rely on within a community compare to assistance from local governments or international sources in terms of its ability to help people recover or be more resilient? So with those questions in mind, we went back to this basic framework. That's essentially, how are we operationalizing the definition of resilience? And as Mark said, it's, we look at it as a set of capacities that are used in connection with some type of shock or stress, but then importantly that they're indexed to some kind of an outcome. And from there, we essentially said, okay, so what data do we need to be able to put that framework into action to be able to answer the questions that we set out? So I'll spend a little bit of time going through these and then break it down slightly further in the next few slides, because I think this is where it gets interesting. What is it measuring? How are we treating these different kinds of factors? So on the capacity side, they're in those same buckets of the research questions: the financial inclusion, income diversification, and what we're calling social support and other aid sources. For financial inclusion, we were looking at things like access to and use of different financial tools. Again, savings, loans, and insurance are the main ones, both formal and informal. We were also looking at levels of financial literacy, which we had analyzed to be very predictive of being financially included. For income diversification, we looked at both the number of income sources as well as their independence. So, for example, having a farm income and an off-farm income through a salaried job, or having a kiosk where you're selling things. And then for social support, again, we looked at whether people were able to rely on other households for assistance in the wake of the typhoon, as well as whether or not they'd received aid from the government or other foreign sources. The measures around shock exposure in this case were fairly straightforward, so we were able to just essentially look at the severity of storm damage. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. What you end up doing with that one is basically saying we're trying to control for how badly people were hit. We're trying to understand, what's the role of financial inclusion in determining a household's ability to maintain food security, given equal damage from the storm, right? So similarly, we felt there were other factors that we needed to control for that we think make a difference to those outcomes. So certainly, household incomes prior to the storm, their asset levels, their land holdings, education levels. These are typical kind of controls that we included in, so we could isolate the effects of these capacities on the left-hand side. And then for the outcomes, in this case, we used one that was an observed measure of food security, so a version of the Coping Strategies Index, as well as some more perception-based measures around people's reported recovery from the storm, as well as their perceived ability to cope with future shocks like that. do actually was trying to relate this back to this this common causal framework that Mark presented. So this is the core of that in terms of the indicators required. I mean, to be honest, I hadn't thought about all of these different areas going in when we designed the study, but I do think we captured most of them. So I'll walk through each of these components: the ex-ante pre-shock component, the disturbance component, and the post-shock component. So for the ex-ante component, there's three categories of indicators: resilience capacities, initial well-being states, and initial vulnerability. So our resilience capacities are, again, those ones that we were looking at that we were programming around and assuming would make a difference to people's ability to deal with future shocks. So we used essentially a retrospective line of questioning of, prior to Yolanda, did your household members have a bank account, a loan, insurance? If so, what type? Same with the questions around income sources, etc. So those are the capacities that we measured pre-shock, although in fact we were gathering the data after the fact. It's a little easier to do in the case of a discrete disaster like this, because there's a point at which people can recall before, and it wasn't a fuzzy time period of drought that came and went. So that's, again, where my mind went with the storm. Initial well-being, we looked at, again, asking prior to the typhoon about income levels, as well as about asset levels that we knew were pretty reliable in terms of recall data. For initial vulnerability, this one I had to kind of think about because I hadn't gone into the study design with it in mind. But we certainly looked at things like income sources, which would be more or less vulnerable to shocks. We did look at the likelihood of falling under the poverty line, so the PPI, Progress Out of Poverty Index. But we could have looked at other things as well, like indebtedness or like physical location of people's households, whether or not they were higher up, so they wouldn't be as affected by storm surge or the aspect of their house towards the storm. Those are good ideas for the future. The disturbance component, we tried two different measures here. Tim didn't go through his in detail, but they had a whole module of 18 questions about whether or not someone had experienced a pest outbreak or a food price spike or a flood, a drought. I mean, it was a range of things. In this case, we were really looking at the impact of a specific shock. And we started actually with the measure on the right, which was just a self-reported, compared to other families, how badly were you affected? I think that can work along the lines of what Tim and the team there did in Prime. In this case, the results that gave us were kind of counterintuitive. So, for example, both households that were affected less and affected more showed that they had, well, Dan, you could explain this one.
Yeah, so the coefficients were in the same direction for being affected less and affected more. So they would both, both the households that were affected less or more would say that they were, less likely to have recovered or less able to cope with future disasters, which suggested to us, along with the nature of the question, that it was a very subjective measurement.
So in this case, we were able to use secondary data on actual wind speeds and storm damage, which was pretty available for this disaster. That's not always the case, but I think in terms of measuring exposure to shocks, that would be the preference in almost any case if it's there. And then the ex-post component. So this is trying to get a handle on what a household or a community looks like after the disaster. Here, the main focus here for us in terms of our analysis was on these well-being outcomes. It also included recovery. So again, measuring coping strategies, asset levels, self-reported recovery, and again, perceived ability to cope with future shocks. There's a case to be made that maintaining your resilience capacities post-shock is also a form of resilience, because you could be depleting, you could be mortgaging your assets in a way that maintains your food security, but to the detriment of your longer-term resilience. So we've also measured those, but it's not something we've really analyzed yet. And then in terms of vulnerability status, post-shock, again, same thing, but just asking for the current status when we were doing the survey, which was several months after the typhoon. So that's, I'm hoping, is a kind of a concrete example of, okay, Mark presents the statistical model. Here's actually how we populated that as part of this study. With the analysis techniques, we essentially relied on two. The main one was the type of multivariate analysis that Tim was describing. They did with prime data, essentially to try to understand again, what are the unique effects of those factors, those capacities on those well-being outcomes or recovery levels, given similar exposure to shocks and other factors. In addition to that, Dan was able to use propensity score matching to try to get a little bit more towards some of the causality that Mark was hinting at. And in this case, we weren't looking at propensity to have participated in the program. In this case, because this was just a baseline that we did this on. But it was propensity to have used a certain financial product. So Dan's got a savings account, Mark doesn't, but it looks as if Mark should, given all his background characteristics. So then the relationship between having that bank account and some of these outcomes is more straightforward, closer to causal. So I thought that was a good way to approach that.
Instrumental variable.
Sorry?
Instrumental variable.
We didn't use any in this instance. I think that would be ideal, but.
All right, and then to give you a sense of the findings, I'll present these in layman's terms in a minute, but we looked at these 4 outcomes across the top, and these 10 or so factors there on the left, where there is a number, the relationship was significant, and for the percentages, these are indices, so it's a percentage, that percentage change in the index is being predicted. For the others, it's just an odds ratio. So you can see, for example, the use of informal savings strongly predicted each of these outcomes. Use of formal savings, just one, so not as strong of a predictor of recovery and resilience. The narrative version of this is, so financial inclusion, certainly having, we found that having access to savings or credit prior to the typhoon aided in recovery. It allowed people to draw on or have access to cash that could buffer the effect of the storm. But as I pointed out just a minute ago, the informal financial tools, savings at home, for example, versus in a bank, were just as effective as, if not more than, having a sort of formal financial product. So that was an interesting challenge to the assumptions that we went into this program with, which is people need to be connected with banks and formal credit, because all the informal credit and savings is not sufficient. So that was a useful finding. For livelihood diversification,
That's an interesting.
yeah, so here, neither having, more income sources or more diverse and independent income sources as we analyzed it, had no effect on people's, any of the outcomes that we looked at. We have thoughts about why that might be. It could be that, the diversification of incomes is just a sort of done out of distress, as poor people tend to do, versus out of proactive risk management. But it's one that I think we want to keep poking at, and we will do so as a follow-up. For social capital and other forms of assistance, there was kind of a pecking order. Actually, aid from the Philippine government was most strongly associated with the most resilience and recovery outcomes. Informal support, so this bonding, what we're calling bonding social capital, was helpful in terms of people's perceived ability to cope in the future, but in terms of their food security status, actually was negatively related. Could be that those people were simply just poorer or worse off, and they had to rely on that kind of assistance. And then having received aid from international sources, including INGOs, not that it had no benefit, it wasn't very instrumental in, at least at the point of the survey, in people's recovery. Yeah, okay. My last slide. It's always good to be honest about these things. So, looking ahead, I mean, what this approach, I think, tells us is a good process for trying to go about resilience measurement and analysis more broadly is start by identifying capacities, link those to what you're going to be programming around. So in this case, I think we did a better job than in the past of narrowing in on 3 factors that we felt like we were going to be making a difference to. Financial inclusion was something we were programming around, livelihoods. And then when we have the chance, like we did here, is really testing whether or not those are testing their predictive power. Are those things actually associated with greater resilience or recovery? And then importantly, doing that over time. So the snapshot we took, a few months after the disaster will certainly look different than it would now. So we'll be going back as part of the program inline and doing a similar analysis to see how things may have changed and whether or not these factors continue to hold to be able to explain people's recovery. One that I think is an important takeaway is, once we have a sense that using informal financial tools is related to greater resilience and recovery, then just focus your M&E on that. It doesn't have to get too complicated. We can just be doing a good, informal savings program and have confidence that, come time, that's going to be an important resilience capacity. And then the last one has nothing to do with resilience at all, but it is saying, okay, once we have these validated capacities, then we need to be able to measure our program's contribution or attribution to those. So in this case, we have an impact evaluation set up as part of this, not to measure resilience, but to measure whether or not more people are connected with banks or savings at homes or these things that we found were important to resilience. So that's it.
So I think what we'll do, just given the time we have left, is we'll roll in the clarifying questions for John with the general Q&A. So at this point, feel free to pose questions about any of the 3 presentations. And again, remember to introduce yourselves when you pose the question. And John, can I get that so I can unmute? I'm going to try unmuting the people on the phone. If we get too much background noise, I'm going to mute you again, and you can pose questions via chat. So, all right. Carlisle, go ahead.
I'm gonna just mention 2 of the hats tonight. And one very briefly, I was working with Maya on developing some guidance on including promoting local ownership and evaluation. And so, John, as you were presenting, I wondered. I have 2 questions for you. So that has a question for you is include there are local actors, participants in the program, in determining which measures would be meaningful. And the second question I have for you is about your findings, which are all very surprising. And so another hat I'm wearing is there's a new task gap order out from CMM that's looking at facility and conflict, providing technical assistance and research services. And the first thing we're going to be looking at conflict sensitivity and food assistance, which of course is related to the work you're doing, talking closely with colleagues, not with you all directly. And so, I wanted you, with that hat on, I wondered if you would go back to your slide on your findings, which were surprising, and talk a little bit more about, when I look at those measures, I'm desperate to unpack them. They're dissatisfying because they're surprising, you don't know why. And so I wondered if, one, you could talk about how local actors were involved in defining your measures and your approaches, and 2, if you could talk about what you've done to unpack some of these findings, especially the surprising ones.
I'll try. You want to take one question at a time?
I think, yeah.
In this case? All right.
Yeah.
Fine. So in terms of figuring out what should we be measuring, that was based more on what we were programming around. It's the type of assessment work that went into deciding that we were going to do mobile bank, mobile cash transfers financial literacy messages, and just local actors were identifying those as priorities. I couldn't speak. I mean, I think generally we do a pretty good job of doing participatory assessments and figuring out, actors that have been on the ground longer than us what makes sense. But I kind of came in after the fact personally. Yeah. For unpacking, I mean, maybe there's a particular one.
Why don't you go with the last one?
Yeah,
of aid from international stars, that one, or the diversification one that was very interesting.
Dan is the one that helps explain these things away. So, can I use Dan?
I think I would start by saying, since this is just a baseline and we're doing, there is, certainly a degree of like omitted variable bias. In terms of the aid, we suspect that we may be seeing families that are particularly affected are receiving more aid, but we are not necessarily able to distinguish. And that is one of the issues that we encountered. So we talked about the fact that the subjective measure of how affected families were by this typhoon, we weren't really satisfied with. And then the next measure we went with was at a larger level. So but the survey is at the community, is at the household level. So we suspect that we're seeing, the hardest hit families were the ones who received the most aid. But the shock was greater for them. Their outcomes were still lower, and we weren't really able to properly control that.
So, just a follow-up question on this. Why did you guys only use one indicator of food security?
You got to fight to get your indicators in, man. It's an emergency. I was lucky to know that. Yeah.
Because usually when we do any of these kinds of surveys, we have at least 2 or 3. Because one is not going to be good enough to tell you. You got to have good work. Same direction. And then the other thing I was wondering was, so you think that, because when we were asking people about shocks and stresses, they were pretty articulate about which ones were more severe than others on them. But you're saying that didn't work here because you only had one major shock?
Yeah, that's what we think. We had one major shock, and the comparison was not kind of between shocks for the same family. It was each household comparing to the rest of the community.
Yeah, okay. So that has a different...
Yeah.
And then the last thing I was going to say, I've already mentioned this to John, is I would move one of these outcome measures that you have on perceived ability to manage future shocks. That's more, for me, a capacity. It's a socio-psychological capacity that people would normally associate with absorptive capacity. They can manage future shocks more so than an outcome. It doesn't mean that you don't measure it or you don't capture that change. It just means because you still need to measure changes in capacity as important results of your work. But I wouldn't confuse it with a well-being outcome measure, which should be more conditional change of whether it's food security or poverty or nutrition.
Let me ask a question that is one of them maybe help Dan unpack those. On the livelihood diversification one, was it just ordinary livelihood diversification, or was it diversified according to risk?
It was ordinary livelihood.
Right. So one of the reasons that one probably didn't scan is if it was risk diversification as opposed to simple diversification of livelihoods independent, not sensitive to risk. That's probably why that one didn't show up. So the other thing that we'll talk about in many measures is the ceiling effect. There's also a floor effect. The things that are hit so badly, it's difficult to have them discriminate what's going on. You need some variation, don't you, to discriminate.
Other questions? Sir? Oh, that's just the, oh, okay. So this is WR, Christy Getman, she's asking if the full report for the Philippines case is available or if you'd be willing to share it.
It's closed?
Yeah.
By
the end of the year.
Fiscal calendar.
Poor Dan.
Now you know what you're doing.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, Jonathan White, I'm World Vision. Thanks so much for the presentation. Our first question would be, are the slides from the presentation going to be circulated or available? Or?
Yes,
That would be great, thank you. The other question is in terms of the framework for resilience when you're looking at multiple scales. So in sort of looking at the USAID learning agenda and saying, okay, we've done so much work around households, but we really need to be bigger, right? We need to take this up to the community level. We've got to get the bonding, the social capital piece, and systems going up to the regional, district, national level, soft shock, things like this. I know it adds another layer of complexity, but it's like you're saying, more uphill climb here, but in each of those areas of capacity, absorbing, adapting, and transforming, are you looking at all those scales within each of those buckets? Or are you largely, trying to narrow those larger sort of systems questions to maybe just looking at those in one of those pillars? Are you having to look at all those layers across those multiple dimensions?
We're trying to.
Yeah.
For example, and I'm going to give Mercy Corps credit for some of this work too. I think they've been working very hard at trying to put together a methodology for more of the systems level analysis to get at the higher level in community, particularly around market systems, but not only market systems, but agroecological systems and social systems that are operating that are broader than community. Like here in Somalia, you would want to know a lot about clan structure and the interactions between these larger social systems. So I think they've got some interesting ideas about how to capture some of that stuff, which would be useful in any kind of diagnosis that you're going to be doing as part of one of these studies. We tried to capture some of those higher level, systems level things in our questionnaires, and also with key informant interviews and things like that. But we probably can always get better at it than we did. So I think one of the things that's interesting is that measuring resilience is a moving target, and what I mean by that is what was state of the art in August is no longer state of the art. Okay, and so how you would have approached the measure of a particular indicator in August changed completely now that we're in December. Okay, so we know, for example, that if you want to get at some of these issues around collective action, you can't just ask whether or not they have a conflict committee, but you need to know something about the functioning of that conflict committee. Is it really working effectively? Or it's not just knowing whether or not people are engaged in disaster risk reduction. You need to know something whether or not that has been successful. So you need to get more at the more in-depth quality part of that. Okay, and some of these other indicators as well. For example, we know that the point about the livelihood diversification one, we know that it's got to be livelihood activities that are in completely different risk profiles is important. Not just how many activities you're engaged in, but are they in completely different risk profiles? That's more important. And how you get at that information is important to understand as well. So, we're getting better at understanding what we need to collect, but, we also realize that you're in a place of time where you took the best shot you did at that time, and so it takes a long time to collect and analyze this data and get it through the aid bureaucracy to be able to release this stuff to people. And so, that data we collected was a year ago, and we're just now releasing it to everybody simply because of all the gauntlets you have to go through to get it out. So, I think it's important to understand that we need to keep looking for ways of making it better, not beat ourselves up for not getting an indicator just right, And we owe it to everybody that's trying to do this to share our lessons as soon as possible. And I appreciate John's honesty about stuff, you know. Share our lessons as soon as possible that this doesn't work or this didn't quite work the way we thought it was going to. I would change it this way so that the next person that's about to launch a big survey is actually collecting it correctly this time, you know, or at least a little bit better than what we thought we did. And so, and I think that's the whole network, this Food Security Information Network that the Technical Working Group is supposed to be part of. It's also what the Food Security Network is, and it's part of what the interaction is all about, is trying to make sure that we're sharing ideas as we're collecting stuff, as we do it, so that we all help each other get better at it. And, you know, not beat each other up. And not try to hide the stuff that didn't work either, you know. I mean, you don't learn from doing it right every time. You got to also learn from doing it wrong.
Carlisle and then Andrew.
I want to follow up on this little exchange between Tim and John. Tim, I was honestly stunned by the amount. I was just looking at your list, and you said, "Oh, each one of these is an index." I was like, "My God, how many questions is an individual answering to try to get at?" And obviously, you would get at much more reliable information than perhaps what John was getting at in the Philippines example. I can see how, ideally, if we really want to know what's going on, we really want to measure the way you're measuring, and what a privilege it is to be able to do that. And I can't imagine being on the data provider end of it. I can't imagine being on the survey respondent end of that. I hope that different survey respondents are answering different pieces of the.
Well, unfortunately, they got elected to be on a panel. So
there they are. There they are. Stuck. Days and days of questions. And realistically speaking, thinking from an NGO perspective, John, when you say, we have to fight to get our indicators in there, I would guess that that's more the reality of an implementing partner, of someone who's trying to do this work. And of course, if you can only get a few indicators in there, then you're not going to get the whole story, and you're left with the main findings, like, what does this mean? Well, I don't know. I wasn't allowed to ask more questions than this. So I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit more about, what else did we need to ask to really know the answer, but why couldn't we, and how do we mediate that to get at what we need to know?
I'd like to take one statement there. One is, and it comes back to the Maserati and the Fiat comment that Mark made. I don't expect everybody to go out and do what we do. Okay? I would not want them to go out and do that. It's way too expensive. But you need to have a few of these out there, okay? So that you can know what you can narrow it down to and still get accurate, high-quality information. So you kind of have to go complex to determine simplicity. And so, as this is exploratory, we're trying to figure out how do you capture some of these things that never really were captured this way. So we want to, but we always are looking for ways to make it shorter, less of a burden for the population we're asking these questions of. So just taking what we've learned from this study, we're now creating a questionnaire that we're going to be using in Niger for a large AID effort on measure resilience there. And we've already started paring it down dramatically on the basis of our analysis that we know already. Okay, so we're learning from it, and we're trying to make it better for the next group that tries it out. Even they will probably have to pare it down the next time they do it. So, and then the other thing that is important to know is what worked in Ethiopia. You have to contextualize it to West Africa, and a lot of that stuff is not the same. So, you have to be somewhat careful about locking stuff out too quickly before you know that context a little bit better. But, I think we're working towards it. So, and I appreciate, we've been working with John on trying to measure this stuff in Somalia and other places, and I think we're getting better at it each time we do it, and you can go back and look at every one of these things and say, well, that didn't work out so well, we shouldn't have done it that way, but, I mean, once is okay, doing the same thing twice is not okay, that means you're insane, right? Because when you keep doing the same thing over and over again.
So let me comment as a follow-up to that, is that what we hope to get to one day, not just a resilience methodologist, is to get to a minimum core data set. Now, if you let me take a moment and talk about the field of medicine. 1 minute. If you go to the doctor's office, what do? Every doctor does it pretty much the same thing if you're just going in for a basic visit. They're going to take blood pressure, they're going to take a look down your, open your mouth, take a look down your throat, take your temperature, listen to your lungs. They got there. About 100 years ago, they draw some blood, throw some leeches on you, and have you drink a tar emulsion and say, I hope you're going to get better. Right? No, we're not quite that bad. I think what we're doing in development. But we're not at the minimum core data set for resilience. And I think Tim and the work John's doing and other NGOs are trying to get down to that minimum core data set. So when you go and say, here are the things that we need.
Oh, no.
And I think your questions are well taken. I've seen household surveys that, I mean, I think they count as a humanitarian violation. There's people sitting for 2 hours.
About 5.
Yeah, 5. 2, 3 hours. How can this be? So, I think we have to get down there. I think, Tim, your comments are really important that not everyone could do that with what they've done. They were well-resourced and they have a lot of capacity at Tango. They can carry that out. But there are certainly lessons to be learned from what they've done. So.
Yeah, I come from an animal health background, so I'm familiar with it. I think this point about...
You guys still use leeches?
Only in Somalia. But I think the need for a gold standard to allow rapid diagnostics to take place is fundamental.
I mean,
if you don't have that gold standard, you cannot have
like waiting is not
trusted
actually
static.
static.
One of the things I think is interesting, if I've got it right, is that both the shocks in the case studies were what one might have expected. Dry conditions in the Horn of Africa, the typhoon coming through the Philippines archipelago. It'd be interesting to include a not business as usual shock. So, food price crisis. How did that affect the Philippines when rice prices spiked out of control? And how resilient were people to that? Just to flip it a bit, because sometimes those kind of like outlier shocks can be the ones that really sort of make or break.
Well, what's interesting is when you compare Jijiga area to Barina area in Ethiopia, Barina it's the droughts, it's the shock, the main shock that people are worried about. In the Somali region, it was food price shocks and animal diseases that were the main ones they were worried about. Okay, so they were struggling with completely different shock approach, and then trying to figure out how to deal with those things. So, it's not always the same across locations.
I just have to sort of completely unrelated question. I'm just interested, those under the social capital, the aid from the local government was effective, whilst the aid from international agencies wasn't. Is that apples and apples or apples and oranges?
I remember the type of assistance being pretty different, so, and help me out again here. International assistance was more likely to be shelter, support, local, whereas food aid was coming from local governments, NFIs, I think. So it was buckets versus.
It just seems that the household level traditional mechanisms cope with the traditional shock quite well. At the institutional level, traditional institutions coped quite well with the traditional shock, whilst the external institutions did less well. Is the pattern there?
Yeah. I think I would have predicted that too, because people that are closer to the ground are going to know what they need more than people that are from outside.
Yeah. Like your pastoralist, it was not that surprising that pastoralists scored better.
We should have seen the people yesterday when I said that. They go, "What? Better than those agro-pastoralists."
Any other questions?
Just two very short ones, and because in New York. One from Mark, and it's in regards to the second paper that you recently produced. Through the research that we've been doing with agricultural livelihoods, we have identified, as many other organizations, the importance of information knowledge for the learning of the communities. And of course, learning is a very important attribute of resilient communities. So I was wondering what is the role of information and knowledge in the resilience capacity category that you are suggesting as part of your conceptualization and your data structure? And the second is more of a reflection, and I was wondering if any of you have any comments on it, that I think it's so important to link resilience with development outcomes. We all understand that. But in so many cases, it is so hard to disaggregate because in many cases, communities become resilient to a particular shock, but that allows them to become resilient to a different stressor. For example, communities in Colombia have become, in certain areas, very resilient to conflict and to violence. And some of those attributes that they have gained have allowed them to become very resilient to climate change stressors. We have research that backs that up. So what I find really complex in practice is to disaggregate where resilient outcomes are linked to a particular stressor, when in reality they may be linked to a variety of stressors. So that's just something that I thought was part of the presentation, and I was wondering, wanted to put it out there.
So on the first question, the knowledge and information that was in, sadly, in one of the slides, I skipped by very quickly. And I think, Tim, I don't know if you can
It's under adaptive.
Yeah, it's under adaptive capacity for knowledge and information. But it's something that we recommend in the paper, something that needs to be unpacked. And in Tango's work, they have begun to measure that as one of the capitals. So, yeah. The second question was again on.
Section on how do you see the challenge of disaggregating resilience?
Yeah, I think, in there'll be looking at it more specific, I can answer generically, as is my job as an academic. Hand it on to reality. Is in the paper, I've actually lost track of what I thought now. Is I think in say the question again.
So in the approach, specifically in the latest papers that you have produced, you suggest, and in the framework that you showed us, to link resilience capacities with a particular development outcome. So for example, in this research, you linked it to food insecurity.
And nutrition and poverty.
And poverty.
Right.
I guess that is the challenge. How do you...
Yeah, so I think that's what I want to say. Toward the end of the paper, we have the next steps, and I think it's going to be worked on empirically to figure out which resilience capacities are broadly applicable, which ones are shock specific in a context specific. I think
as part of the ongoing research.
Yeah. So,
I've done that.
More work we see down that area. Let's see. Because once you figure out which ones are broadly applicable, we will want to invest in those. We're starting some work. In fact, Tim and I are, and a few other institutions are doing some work with the technical consortium in one of the CGIAR centers in Nairobi. And one thing we're looking at is how can resilience measurement support investment decisions for shocks. And so certainly in that work, we're trying to figure out which ones are most broadly applicable. Because ultimately, you're trying to determine through the Ending Drought Emergencies Common Program Framework where can they get the most bang for the buck. Where is the most, how to optimize investments. We'll be trying to take that apart.
Any other questions?
I have a question. So following up on this conversation about not having too few indicators, not having too many, Tim, you said in your presentation that while those 4 indicators wouldn't be the indicators you want to use everywhere, there's a methodology for getting down to the 4 that is applicable. Could you talk a little bit more about that methodology? Or where can we find more information about that methodology?
We have to write it up, but it's basically factor analysis.
Yeah, statement.
So I can share that with you.
So there's 2 parts of one is the factor analysis, looks at how items hang together, and then if you want to kind of inject that with a steroidal injection of causal inference, then you move towards structural equation modeling. I don't know, maybe you know more about that than I do. Structural equation modeling takes kind of looks at how items hang together, then looks particularly how they hang together with respect to something you're trying to predict. And this was your question over here. We're looking at how they hang together, so they correlate, how they cohere, or that they then, indicators in and of themselves have predictive capacity. Structural equation modeling kind of nourishes the factorial analysis approach in the direction of causal.
So some of this stuff is, you have to use factor analysis and different kinds of factor analysis, depending on whether you've got ordinal or nominal variables. So there is some more sophisticated statistical techniques so it's not for everybody. But the and then before you can even get to the regression stuff, where you're really trying to get at some of these causal stuff. So what we're trying to do is first figure out which indicators should be in the index in the first place, and then if you look at all those indicators that show a positive relationship in the index, and you want to get rid of some of them without losing too much predictive value, that you can do another set of correlations on that. That will help you figure that out. So we can show you that method.
I have a question. So something that's going through my mind, maybe others as well. Can you go back up a few? The slide that keep going. A lot of this analysis that we're talking about here, and a few more, is mostly aimed at sort of diagnosing what is it we should be investing in if we want to get more resilience in the end of the day, right? So it's all these capacities and trying to parse out, is it this, that, what combination? Sorry. There you go. Perfect. But I feel like I get responses from people in the field that they're interested in that, but maybe that's a heavy lift, try to do that every time you're going, to do a program evaluation or assessment. So I wonder if we just were trying to look at, a black box of, did we make a difference to resilience, not what made a difference. Could you essentially, ignore that capacities column and say, let's just say you called that, program or no program, right? Mm-hmm. And then you were to hold constant things like, exposure to the shocks, whatever they were, and the combinations, some other background characteristics, and then link it to an outcome. And simply say, yes or no is program, in this case, for this population. Because I think a lot of people are looking for that. What's the resilience measure, right? And what we're talking about here are models. They're not measures that you can use. Even these capacities are not, it's not resilience in itself. So what's an easier way to be able to do that for NGOs?
That's a pretty interesting idea. Because there's a distinction between what you're talking about is causal description. We knew, for example, that aspirin had this effect, but nobody, for a while, for some period, no one knew what the causal agent was. But it was pretty good that we knew it, that it had a desired effect. So they couldn't explain what the effect is. But typically, the explanatory work is much more difficult, it's more expensive, and requires more data. And I'm wondering, I really don't know, whether, are we doing a good thing or a bad thing in the interim, settling for descriptive information? That's a causal description. We say, if this exists, then it seems to produce this. I'm not sure why it's happening. But, and I'm actually unsure of one of the analytics of it I know what's involved, the ethics and what it does to policy and how we think through development. I'm really unclear.
So one of the advantages I see of looking at using a resilience lens to look at your interventions, okay, is that, and if you break it up into these capacities, and these capacities are not mutually exclusive. We know that absorptive and adaptive and transformative overlap each other. In fact, you even use some of the same indicators to construct them. But looking at it through these three capacities allows people that normally would only do humanitarian assistance and people that only would do development assistance to actually talk to each other with a common framework.
Tim, just to clarify, by three you mean the absorptive, adaptive, not the...
Yeah, absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity. So, a lot of the people that were normally kind of just doing humanitarian or emergency support, they would be talking about absorptive capacity. The people that would normally be working on maybe agricultural interventions or livelihood type activities would be talking a lot about adaptive capacity. And a lot of the capacity building in government and building up institutions and market systems, they would be more of the development guys that would be focused on that. And so getting all of them on the same playing field, using a completely different way of looking at things, not dividing it from humanitarian versus development, but in fact, those three types of capacities and how each contributes to that, it makes a huge difference. And then you can look at your interventions and see how they actually support each of those types of capacities. And your diagnostic in terms of your comprehensive assessment at the beginning to do your problem analysis and your opportunity analysis should tell you through your theory of change where the leverage points are going to be in those different kinds of capacities. Where are they weak on those different kinds of capacities, and are we aligned with our interventions to strengthen those things?
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean you have to recategorize your interventions. It just allows you to look at those interventions through that resilience lens. And one of the things I've always said is that I don't want to hear about a resilience program. I want to hear about how resilience lens makes your particular sector activity more effective. Okay? So whether you're, because you still have to do good programming around health, there's still good programming around agriculture, still good programming around water. You don't want to substitute a resilience program for a good water program. You want to use a resilience lens at whether or not that water program needs to take risk management into account to make sure that you actually achieve the outcomes that you're trying to do in that particular sector. So, that's why using these kind of capacity lenses is so important. And then it gets the emergency guys and development guys working around these different sectors to talk to each other, to actually see how they actually are informing and targeting, strengthening these capacities. Because in the end, what gets left behind that's sustainable is not the structural thing you build. There are lots of monuments to development. In the end, if you have increased people's capacities to manage the shocks and stresses that they're exposed to, they will do it on their own. They don't need you anymore. And so that's what we're striving for. That's what development should be all about.
I mean, that's all well taken, and I think measurement can help drive that kind of thinking and that kind of integration by laying all this out. Where I'm coming from is people are, going through the typical program design and M&E plan, and say, okay, I've got my high-level objective, and it's resilient, livelihood resilience, and my indicator for that is going to be coping strategies, right? I mean, this happens every week. So if we're coming back and saying, well, not quite, because it would be fine. Coping strategy is a good outcome, but it really isn't resilience until it's been affected by a shock, and we're able to see, the dynamics around that. So I'm just wondering, what, again, trying to pare this down to something a little bit more doable for, an NGO type project design. I wonder if there's ways to be able to.
See, I don't think you would ever want to have resilience as your goal. Resilience is your process to get to that goal. The goal should always be some kind of, whether it's poverty alleviation or improved food security or improved nutrition or improved health. That's your goal. And then you're trying to make sure that you achieve that goal with taking risk management into account, that you are trying to make sure that you are taking into account all the kinds of shocks and stresses people are exposed to so that they have the capacity to overcome those things to still achieve that goal. And when you put resilience at the top as a goal, that's misunderstanding the concept.
So I'm going to...
You need to wrap up.
Yeah, I need to wrap up, but just maybe a couple of minutes of any key takeaways from this conversation from our...
I have one very quick one, picking up on a point that Tim just made about creating the bridge between humanitarian action and development assistance. Resilience has something that resembles a brand value now. And a brand is defined in the business world as a promise. And one of the promises that's been made is that it's going to help bridge this divide between humanitarian assistance and humanitarian aid and development assistance. That's critical. I think that point you made really needs to be emphasized. And I think we need to think carefully what promises is resilience making. If we don't, and we don't get the metrics lined up and our programming doesn't line up and all these things, 5 years from now we'll be sitting here having a conversation about X. I kind of don't want to do it again. I should get my real estate license instead or something. But I think we carefully, and I think that is one of the promises that was made up front. That is one of the promises that's been made.
You're more resilient.
Yeah. But I think my closing comments would be we have to think about how does our measurement work serve the interests of our programming initiatives. And I think that a critical part, again echoing something that Tim just mentioned, is that if you walk into a room and people say, now I have to do resilience, something else on top of what I'm doing, then it's dead. We're gone. If the question is, how can resilience help me do what I'm already trying to do? Because we know what we're trying to do. It doesn't change our mission. It should enable our mission. I think that's the key point. So.
I mean, mine would make a similar point that I think that the message would be that this stuff is doable. There's not a lot of new information that we're looking at here. It's kind of how we're going about understanding the relationships between them. So maybe the measurement of shocks and people's exposure to them is not something we typically do. We're looking at just what changes are we accountable for. So I think a little more proactive thought about digesting these frameworks and thinking about, okay, what would we need in the sort of the quick turnaround of proposals or emergency programs to be able to put into a survey or any other data collection to be able to come out the other end with a decent analysis. That's worth investing.
Tim, any final words, parting thoughts?
Well, one thing I would like to say, and I want to follow up on what John said, is I think we already collect 90% of the information we need. We just need to analyze it slightly differently. And then, fill in the gaps where we don't have certain kinds of information. So one of the things that we've been trying to do in this technical working group is say, okay, there's an awful lot of data sets that are already out there. Have they ever been looked at using a resilience lens? So that, it will tell us quite a bit already about what context that we're working in and what might work and what might not work and what we still need to collect information on. And so that way the cost of the burden of all this stuff will go down dramatically, I think, if we just learn how to do that better. So, the World Bank, every country that we work in has these income expenditure surveys. World Food Program's doing these surveys all the time. Everybody's doing these surveys all the time. We should be able to take advantage of these things and, try to analyze them slightly differently than we have in the past and see what we're missing and then fill in those gaps. And then I think we can do a lot with what we already have. So that's all I want to say.
And I'll just mention one additional resource, add something to that list. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, if you don't know, has an evaluation catalog, and they're putting up their survey data. So that's another source for secondary data to take a look at. Well, this is the end of our time, but this is great. It's great to have a follow-up. Like Tim observed, it's great to have presenters be so open about their experiences, because that is the only way we're going to learn. And like I said a bit earlier, we do hope to follow this up with a presentation from LWR. If anyone else here in the room would be interested in sharing their experience on resilience measurements, feel free to contact me and we could put that together. And thank you all.
Thank you.